Look, you must be very worried about the difference we're seeing here between Scott Morrison, who wants to manage the virus, learn to live with the virus, free up the country, not just for the economy. People want to pit it as the economy against people, but to get society moving again and communities engaged again, whereas you have a Labor Premier in Victoria who seems just completely bunkered in and focused on bunkering down until there's a virus, until there's a vaccine.
Well, look, I have to say, I think it's completely ridiculous what the Premier is doing. Just this week, we hear that he was wanting to extend emergency powers for a further 12 months, up to 18 months. I have to say, Chris, I have an unprecedented amount of phone calls and emails to my office this week. We've completely been overwhelmed by people who are very angry about this. And that's because they see this concept of, yes, we've had this acute crisis, and yes, state emergency powers are relevant, but to sort of say carte blanche, we're going to let you do this on an ongoing basis without checking in with the democratic process. It suggests that really our democracy is at risk. And I myself believe that every 6 months is an appropriate thing to discuss through the democratic processes of government and in the parliament about the permission, are we going in the right direction? So for the Victorian Premier to suddenly say, well, trust me on this one, I can predict out 12 or 18 months and I want you to just listen to me without us having to reassess whether the democratic principles are the right ones or not, is just really quite extraordinary. It
is worrying. I think you're being very generous with 6 months, but that's fair enough. I think even quarterly might be more appropriate. Just a correction there, of course, you are in Canberra, you're a Melbourne MP, but you're staying up there to complete the sitting fortnight rather than go back through isolation and the rest of it. I want to just put to you something that we heard on this program last night from Professor Peter Collignon, an infectious diseases expert. And he was talking about the infection curve in Victoria and what's happened to it. And he suggests, listen to this comment, but he's suggesting here that the curfew and the stage 4 lockdown have been superfluous, that the other measures were already working in Victoria. Have a listen.
We had the epidemic in March and April and it turned around, and it probably turned around before all the more major restrictions were put in place. Now, it's not that restrictions won't aid it. You know, you'll get more benefit if you really have everybody stay at home and not move around and curfews. But how much extra benefit, at what cost, I think we're going to have to start working that out. Because if you look at last March and April, the two places that had the hardest lockdown, New Zealand and actually Victoria, haven't necessarily had the best results over the medium term.
Does he have a point, Katie Allen, that state premiers have jumped ahead? They've been nervous and twitchy, jumping ahead with the measures and restrictions before they've given the previous restrictions a chance to prove themselves up?
Look, I think we know that if you restrict movement, you get a decrease in contagion and infection. I don't think there's much question about that. The question is, of the restrictions, which part is working? And so stage 4 lockdown have been pretty severe and widespread. So who knows whether the curfew has added to that. I know that in Melbourne, the curfew, before the curfew, there was a lot of decreased activity in the evenings, and you've got nowhere to go out to. If the restaurants and the pubs and the clubs and all the activities are closed, then people aren't going to be out and about, and we are in deep winter in Melbourne. So whether the curfew has added anything on top of what was already pretty widespread restrictions is not really clear. But that being said, if you restrict movement, we do know you do curtail the pandemic, and that's because this is a highly contagious virus. But I would like to go back to what the problem was in the first place. We know that what really does work is the restrictions and hard borders with the international border closure.
Sure.
We know that that worked. And we know that what happened in Victoria was the quarantining broke down, and then there wasn't a good support system of proper, directed, targeted tracking and tracing. And in fact, this whole sort of broad sweep of tracing in postcodes, which was non-specific, not keeping on top of the daily case rate, and so therefore it was getting out of control. So we do know what works, and I would have loved it if the rest of Australia had happened in Victoria, which is good quarantining, putting out spot fires with tracking and tracing and being very targeted. So we had a great strategy and we were let down in Victoria.
I just want to show you some research that we shared on the program last night from Roy Morgan Research about Victorian attitudes to the lockdown measures. I think the first one we're going to show here is this restriction to staying within 5 kilometres of your home. At the moment, 71% of Victorians say they don't want that lifted. They're happy for that to stay in place. They said no. Only 29% want it scrapped. I think if we go to the next one now, we will see similar statistics when it comes to whether the curfew should end. More than 72% of Victorians say no, they're happy for the curfew to stay in place now. And then we go to this measure, which I think relates to compulsory mask wearing. That's perhaps less surprising. Nearly 90% of people happy to keep masks compulsory, although I would have thought it should only be in crowded places. And this one is the only one that gets close. Should people be free to visit members of their own family? Still the minority. Only 43% say, yeah, we want that freedom. 57% say no. Are you surprised that Victorians are so supportive of these measures, Katie Allen? Have they got Stockholm syndrome?
Look, I think what I would say is that we've put a lot of effort into supporting, trusting and respecting all levels of government to perform and deliver for Victorians and for all of Australia. And I think in a crisis, extraordinary powers are given to our elected representatives. And to be fair, I think that Australians think we've got to all be in this together. We'll take the hit from a point of view of restrictions, and then we can get control of COVID and we can get back to work. So I think Australians do believe and understand that scientifically, restriction of movement and mask wearing both contribute to getting this pandemic under control, and the evidence is showing that. So I'm not surprised that Melburnians, Victorians, Australians understand that they need to give up their personal freedoms in order to get COVID under control. But then what they want to see is they want to see those restrictions lifted and they want to get back to work. And so we've got to get the balance right. And we don't want to be closed a day longer than we need to be. But also people don't want to give up on the many months, the weeks and many months that they've put their lives on hold to then lose control again. And that's why the quarantining and the track and tracing in Victoria has been so disappointing, not just for Melburnians, Victorians, but for all of Australia.